Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 4 of the Experimental Curators Hub. Very excited to come back with a fantastic panel today. Prateek.
Yeah, I'll make the. We just wait for more people to join as they are. So yes, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today on the day 4 of Experimental Curators Hub. We are thrilled to have you here. After yesterday's riveting conversation between Nigerian artists and sculptor NDDK and the curator of international art at Tate Modern, Osei Bonsu, today we welcome amidst us a dear friend and an amazing historian and curator, Rattanamol Johal, who's based in New York and is joining us from New York and a very early morning there. Thank you, Ratan, for joining. As is with this year's hub, Ratan in turn invited the absolutely amazing Emily Jacir and Aline Khoury from Dar Yusuf Nasri Jacir Foundation for Art and Research, Bethlehem. Their work is totally amazingly incredible, and I've been following the work for a while. Both Priyanka and I are totally inspired, and I'm sure by the end of this conversation, several of yours will be too. That the initiative it builds between itself is about community practices and collaborative work, and they're also deeply interested in the archive, working out of Bethlehem, and also the archive of the building where they're located in. We can't wait to hear from them, and are extremely excited to having you join us today. Thank you, Emily and Aline. Thank you for joining and accepting our invitation. To the audience, once again, I would urge you to please put your questions in the Q&A box through the conversation. We will, Natasha, who's very ably going to handle the conversation, will take the questions up with the participants at a later stage. Put the questions in the Q&A box, and remember that if you are feeling shy and not sure, you can also ask the questions anonymously. There's an option on Zoom for that. No such option in the real hub, but since we're on Zoom right now. And then, of course, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the Australia Council for the Arts, Australian High Commission in Kolkata, the Goethe Institute in Kolkata, Take on Art Magazine, and Art Review. Without your support, this would not be possible. And finally, I would again thank and express our deepest gratitude to Natasha Jinwala, who brings to the hub deep insights and holds it together very closely. Thank you, Natasha. Over to you.
Welcome to day 4 of Experimental Curators Hub. Thank you, Prateek, for the warm words of welcome and introduction of our guests today. So as you all have noticed, this hub, in a sense, we've been really taking our time, having one dialogue each day and having sort of substantial time to actually go through various realms of practice, methodology, value systems, the questions of infrastructure building and infrastructural breakdown within our various scenes across the world, really mapping these possibilities and challenges with extremely inspiring guests. So we thank you for being with us this year. Those of you who have been joining, artists especially, also some of our curators who have been part of previous editions, and cultural organizers who are continuing to work courageously as the pandemic continues also to be extremely destructive and uneven in many contexts across South Asia, but also around the world. And I want to, with that, also mention yesterday's session. As Prateek said, Ndidi Dike and Osei Bonsu were in dialogue yesterday, and it was really a very honest and open approach to looking at their relationality across practice, opening up in depth one particular work, A History of a City in a Box, which they went in depth with, and through that addressed aspects of bureaucracy within the realm of governance, of everyday life, of within independent history of Nigeria. What does it mean today in terms of also some of the violent upheavals in that context? They also talked about CCA Lagos and the inspiration that has come from BC Silva and her relationship with Ndidi as an artist. So there were many aspects that were touched on, and we're extremely grateful for those insights. It also left me thinking, as we did discuss, how does one speak from a diaspora position within these contexts that we work through? What does it mean to depart and return and continue to work between the hemispheres? And I was thinking about this quote from James Baldwin, who wrote, "Perhaps home is not a place, but simply an irrevocable condition." And I think in many ways, especially through pandemic reality, this resonates with many of us who are often not out of choice, bound to certain places and certain spheres. So with that, I also invite you to read through Mario de Souza's blog entry that reflects on yesterday's session. And inviting our guests for today with two other reflections. In Edouard Glisson's Poetics of Relation, a text that is so seminal, he wrote, "Thought of the other is the moral generosity disposing me to accept the principle of alterity, to conceive of the world as not simple and straightforward, with only one truth, mine, but thought of the other can dwell within me without making me alter course, without prizing me open, without changing me within myself. An ethical principle, it is enough that I not violate it. The thought of the other of thought is precisely this altering. Then I have to act. I change, I exchange. This is an aesthetics of turbulence, whose corresponding ethics is not provided in advance." And of course, this text is very well known and often quoted, but I couldn't help but think about this notion of aesthetics of turbulence, particularly considering the immense work of Emily Jacir and Aline Khoury and their organization, Dar Jacir. We know why one speaks of these questions of violation, alterity, truth, and it will become very evident through also the work that they will be sharing with us today. It's work that is bold, that is enduring, and we pay our respects for it. Also, I was thinking very much about notion of heritage justice, which again, in the context of Palestine, feels extremely relevant. And so this question of heritage justice actually was addressed by Benedict Savoy in an interview that was published by Art Review on the argument for restitution. And I just found it quite interesting how, on the one hand, when Benedict Savoy and Feldman-Zar talk about restitution as a new relational ethics, then how do we consider this kind of question? One, as they say, as a matter of justice, but also really considering this term heritage justice in the way that it enables historiographies to be chronicled in the present, to be told, and through it to reclaim a sense of freedom. And that is sort of, again, something that I'm just putting out there for us to perhaps pick up on later. And to introduce our guests, I will read a little bit of their biographies. You also have the full biographies online. Rattanamol Singh Johal is an art historian and curator based in New York City. He is currently a doctoral candidate at Columbia University and has held fellowships and curatorial roles at the Museum of Modern Art, Tate Modern, and Whitney Independent Study Program. He has also been involved with Khoury International Artists Association. As poetic as it is political and biographical, Emily Jacir's work investigates translation, transformation, resistance, and movement. Jacir has built a complex and compelling oeuvre through a diverse range of media and methodologies that include unearthing historical material, performative gestures, and in-depth research. Her work spans a range of strategies that include film, photography, signature interventions, but also archiving, performance, video, writing, and sound. She investigates personal and collective moments through public space and its implications on the physical and social experience of Mediterranean space and time. Emily has been part of various juries and won several awards, which include the Golden Lion at the 52nd Venice Biennale, as well as the Prince Claus Award. Some of her projects, which I hope we can kind of go into a little bit also in the Q&A, have included various forms of knowledge production. And this is not only within the context of Dar Jacir, but also within her own work, for instance, at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, where she held workshops with students from Ramallah, and they were alongside Irish participants. And these are some of the ways in which she has been really part of the context of Ramallah, also within different organization setups, and continually working through realms of pedagogy and participation. Aline Khoury is cultural manager, producer, and researcher living and working in Jerusalem. She is currently the programs director at Dar Yusuf Nasri Jacir for Art and Research in Bethlehem since 2019, and has previously worked as a project manager at Al Mamal Foundation for Contemporary Art in Jerusalem from 2014 to 19. She was also an assistant curator on Subcontracted Nations, A.M. Katan Foundation's inaugural exhibition, and has been a member of Kalandia International from 2015 to 18 and the Shafak Jerusalem Arts Network. She is a regional facilitator in Arts Collaboratory, an organization we all know quite well, with socially engaged arts organizations from around the world. She also works independently as a strategic consultant and development advisor for arts and cultural organizations, with a focus on Jerusalem and the Palestinian art scene. Welcome.
Thank you, Natasha, for that generous introduction and for your deeply thoughtful interventions at every stage of this process. Huge thanks also, of course, to Priyanka, Pratik, Joshua, Vidhi, and the rest of the brilliant team at Experimenter Gallery, and to our audience and fellow participants in the Hub who've animated this virtual space over the past few days and will continue to do so. Needless to say, we wish we could all have been together in Kolkata. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that I speak today from Brooklyn, New York, part of the unceded ancestral homeland of the Lenape people. As a sign of respect, I recognize and honor the Lenape nations, their elders past and present, and future generations. In addition to acknowledging the Lenape still present in Lenapehoking, and in the specific context of our transnational gathering today, I want to express my solidarity with diverse forms of resistance to the violence and lived conditions produced by settler colonial occupation here and elsewhere. I also want to share that as a teacher at Columbia University, I'm currently on strike with fellow members of the Student Workers of Columbia Union. We're striking in response to the university's refusal to meet the union's core demands, including a living wage and comprehensive health insurance coverage. When I received the invitation to this year's Hub, I took note of the provocation to consider the question of a scaffolding for practice, which resonated both literally and conceptually in a number of ways. How do we lay the foundation for the work we would like to do? How is infrastructure created incrementally and iteratively as conversations, questions, needs, ideas, and relationships coalesce over time into different forms? When exhibition making and/or collection building isn't the goal, what possibilities are opened up for sharing and creating knowledge collectively? Versions of such questions pervade contemporary curatorial discourse, and a platform like this allows us to offer responses and reflections rooted in place and experience. My own trajectory has been meandering, always somewhat uneasy about being called a curator, yet working inside and around institutions that have defined this mode of professional practice in the present. I got my start almost exactly a decade ago at Khoury in New Delhi, as Natasha said, working with colleagues there to imagine a more stable scaffolding for artistic practice, which involved the physical expansion of the spaces and facilities, as well as an extension of the organization's commitment to experimentation through residencies and workshops. I left a couple of years later to pursue graduate study in New York, which eventually brought me to the Museum of Modern Art as a research and curatorial fellow. Here too, the institutional scaffolding was being extended and reconfigured, once again, both spatially and programmatically, to accommodate narratives of modernism that had remained largely peripheral to its own notoriously Euro-American core. It was during this period, as a participant in the Whitney Independent Study Program, that I first heard Emily Jacir speak about works like Material for a Film and Where We Come From, works that I have often revisited for their powerful aesthetic and affective invocation of memory, desire, and the conditions of exile. Even then, I was struck by the manner in which Emily has continuously engaged in organizing education and multiple forms of collaboration. In this sense, the establishment in Bethlehem in 2014 of Dar Yusuf Nasri Jacir for Art and Research with her co-founders Anne-Marie and Yusuf should be understood within this expansive consideration of curatorial practice that the hub takes as its premise, spanning the activist, archival, artistic, agricultural, pedagogical, infrastructural, and imaginary realms, among others. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to Dar Jacir for accepting my invitation and to Emily for bringing in Aline Khoury, the foundation's managing director and a researcher, producer, and cultural organizer. We've had a wonderfully rich dialogue over the past weeks with many generative threads and palpable excitement leading up to today. And we're thrilled to continue this conversation with you. And without saying more at this point, I've already spoken too much. I want to ask Emily and Aline to introduce themselves by sharing a couple of projects that they've worked on individually preceding Dar Jacir, which provided significant learnings and networks that they continue to carry with them.
Hello, you can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us today, but also, I mean, Natasha, that was such a brilliant introduction. And Ratan, I'm so grateful that you invited us, and also the dialogue, the careful dialogue you've engaged in with us over the course of the past couple of weeks, which we are really looking forward to continuing with you after this. And of course, everyone at Experimenter who has been fantastic. And next time we will be all together there, hopefully physically. So without further ado, I will share my screen. Let's see, share. Or Aline, do you want to say hello first or do it as an intro? All right, sharing my screen. Okay, so for the purposes of today's discussion, I chose two prior projects that I thought would bear quite a bit of connection to speaking about Dar Jacir and the themes of this year's Experimenter that I'd like to share with you. Over the last 2 decades, I have taken on various roles in both education and organizing in Palestine, working within existing infrastructures as well as creating new initiatives. So the first project, which I would like to speak about, was called the Palestine International Video Festival, that I conceived of and co-curated with the artist John Menick. And at that time, the situation on the ground was very different than it is now. We had daily curfews, closure, aerial bombardments, sieges, and invasions. So at that time, the festival was an attempt to breach and intellectual isolation brought about by the occupation. And at that time, it was really important to engage international artists as well as introduce video art. Quoting Vera Tamari at the inauguration at Birzeit University, she said, "It will hopefully mark the beginning of an ongoing dialogue between the international cultural community and the residents of Palestine." So the festival, which was curated and organized by artists, led by artists, what we did is it took place in multiple places and sites, from televisions to cultural centers to people's homes to universities. The themes that were explored were diverse, from the prison industrial complex to immigration to border issues such as the US-Mexico border, revolutions and resistance from Ireland to South Africa to Chile. And very important was also stories of the First Nations. So the themes had come out of my observation that at that time, it felt that things were one directional. We were always being, there was this focus on us and our suffering without an actual genuine exchange of what kinds of suffering are happening elsewhere, and a dialogue that was really multi-directional back and forth. So the strategy we used, as I said, was to parasite off various cultural centers. Some of them was the Popular Arts Center, the Sekekini Center, El Kasaba Theater, and Adil Gallery in Jerusalem, and the Kaptan Foundation, as well as many others. We also managed to organize with local TV stations to organize screenings on TV. It was also an important moment because for the first time, works from the region, which had never screened before in Palestine, like Walid Rad's The Weight of a Dead Horse Hangs, Hostage, and the Bashar tapes, as well as Akram Zaatari's Red Chewing Gum, His and Her, people like Jace Saloom were shown for the first time. Also Carol Mansour. And of course, I mean, I love showing this because it's so dated now, but we started a video art collection at Birzeit University that was open to the public for everybody. Oh, and this is actually, I'm sorry, I'm going back to this because this is also important. Something else about the videotapes. Due to the curfews, which in some cities began at 6 p.m., we organized it so the festival actually took place in people's living rooms, which now seems completely normal during the pandemic, but at that time it wasn't. So people's homes became places for presenting thoughts, looking at archival materials, screening films, and presenting documents and having discussions. And so these videos were in circulation, and then they ultimately ended up as a video archive at Birzeit University. And then there were several workshops that were conducted. And I should say here, because I would like to honor her, is that Vera Tamari and her role as an artist and educator at Birzeit University cannot be overemphasized. As someone who has taught there for decades and has brought in people outside of the educational system, artists like me, to work within the university. So her role is actually crucial. And then just to end about this particular project, again, the approach was a cross-border collaboration across multiple institutions and cities throughout Palestine with a variety of locations, which was basically an innovative ideology and one of the first instances when this kind of situation occurred, coming into being and organized by artists, not the institutions and their respective heads. So our intention was multi-layered, practical, experimental, and as I said, artist run, but also without any funding and no donors. The spirit of solidarity and cooperation across all the cities and organizations, despite the challenges, was an approach that was later adopted by many institutions and which is now kind of the norm, actually, when I think about it in Palestine. The other project which I would like to point to is also the International Academy of Art in Palestine, where I taught for 10 years and was also one of the founders. Because I really think that part of my pedagogy during those years that I taught there, which by the way offered higher education in the arts for free for students, they all had full scholarships. And it was an experimental meeting place and an experimental way of teaching with cultural practitioners locally and from around the world. This is Jean Fisher, from Jean Fisher when she came to speak to us and work with the students. So during that period, it was real. Some of the things that were really vital to me was that I wanted to collect in the classroom fragments of local knowledge from educators and histories that had been sort of cut from the historical knowledge of this younger generation and what preceded them, because we didn't have any kind of history. It's just that we have this problem of amnesia. And it seems to be cyclical. So my work there was also to try to resist this forgetting and to bring into the classroom multiple generations and to try to connect these generations with each other and have a cross-generational dialogue. The other important element of the teaching was that was taking students out walking as a regular learning practice was core to my teaching, not only as a medium for information, but also networking and linking to various groups in the city. Walking in the city is an active way to experience what is going on. And through the experience of walking, we were able to map the changes that were happening, and quite rapidly, I might add, with firsthand direct knowledge. So for me, it was really important that I imparted this idea that learning as a practice does not just take place inside a white room through standardized methods. And the key to the walking was actually its historical trajectory, in which now I should mention Munir Fashe. So he is the one that actually inspired the whole teaching thing the whole walking thing when I started teaching. And he had gotten the idea from Khalil al-Sakakini, who was the director of his school when he was a boy. And he had said that when he was a student, Khalil Sakakini would close the school every Saturday and take everyone out to go for a walk. And he used to say that you could not learn about Palestine from books, but from walking. And they used to walk from all the way the north, our border with Lebanon, all the way down to the south to Gaza. And the other thing, I think I'm taking too much time, so I'm going to wrap this up. The other thing that was important about this space for me too was that I had the freedom to design the courses in any way I wanted, which meant for me, it was really essential that the courses came out of my interactions and collaborations with the students. So that space was a space of collective knowledge. What I would teach one semester, I would never teach another semester because the students would change, their concerns would change. So I really saw it as a space where we were working and creating this collective knowledge together. And that was an essential thing. Oops. And then as Natasha mentioned, I often do, when I always try to take my students or have an educational component as part of my exhibitions. I had a huge survey show in Jordan, in Amman, and took all the students with me there. Here we are with the artist Abdul Hayy al-Musallam, Rami Daher. And then again, when I had the survey show in Ireland, I also organized a group of students to come with me and did a whole 2-week exchange and collaboration with students from 5 universities in Ireland. And I think I will end here and let Aline take over. Aline?
Hello. My video is not turning on. If someone can help me out.
I'm going to turn my sound off.
Oh,
Hi,
we see
everyone.
you.
Yay,
Hi.
I'm here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's with us. I'm equally grateful to Ratan and the team at Experimenter, and I'm very excited about the conversation. I'll try to keep this part short, or as short as I can. So over the last 10 years or so, I've been working with arts organizations, public programs, workshops, festivals, also the Biennale in Palestine. I want to bring two projects or works that I was involved in that really inform my work as a cultural worker and an organizer, and how, and what it means to work closely with the collectives and communities. So one place that was really special to me, and I was able to contribute to the cultural landscape in my home city, was Al-Ma'mal. We can get to the next slide to see what Al-Ma'mal is. Al-Ma'mal was active from the late 90s in Jerusalem. It was one of the first arts organizations. It was focused primarily on contemporary art and exhibitions, and played an important role in paving the way for several Palestinian artists over its 20 years of work. When I joined in 2014, the reality was very sad and different from its formative years. The separation wall had split Palestinian art community, and many artists left the city due to increasingly harsh Israeli policies and difficult living conditions. The organization had moved into its newly renovated space and was facing a financial crisis, as many funders were stepping out of Palestine due to anti-terrorism policies, which included Ford Foundation, which was a backbone for many cultural organizations. The old city where Ma'mal is situated is quite a ghost town, especially when the sun sets. There weren't any social spaces for Palestinians to gather. There wasn't this culture of bars and cafes. People were simply trying to survive through the day-to-day. I found myself spending a lot of time alone between art and the walls of the space for weeks on end after openings. We can see the space inside. Yeah, so I was saying, and I kept questioning this form of exhibition making and contemporary art in respect to that time and context. My main focus during my time at Al-Ma'mal was really to activate the site and open it up to artists and creatives across all art disciplines and age groups. And it really started from a really sweet encounter with 4 to 5 high school students who felt like they discovered this gem inside the city. And through a conversation, they asked me if they could perform. They had this small band of theirs. So I discussed it with the rest of the team, and we thought about it, and they welcomed it. So we started this series of open mics. And then I gave these youth the stage, quite literally. If you move to the next slide, you can see them. They were hosting it, they were performing on the stage, invited their friends and families. And literally from one event to another, it was growing and growing. We were overwhelmed by the large community of artists, dancers, performers, writers, and musicians that just took up the stage. This seems to be like an open mic is something that's known everywhere, but in Jerusalem, it was just something that a platform that opened up space for artists to perform and express themselves. And it was really beautiful, especially in such a hostile and void city. If we look through the rest of the photos, whilst I just give a bit of a background, from there, after the open mics, we just started doing programs every Friday and offering the space to the community. Sadly, it became known as the only place in the eastern side of the city that offered live music. Although it has this legacy of art, contemporary art and exhibitions, we sort of activated the site for other possibilities. We built a bar, introduced modest tickets at the door, which allowed for the program to continue and sustain itself without any funding. And it opened up avenues for other collaborations with concerts, markets, screenings, and more. The space became a social and artistic place for the city and art community, and it even changed the street completely. The restaurant stayed open later into the night, and people were encouraged to visit the city before the events or after and explore it. So here, this was just an example of activating a physical space in a very hostile, violent city that continues to face a lot of harsh policies till today, but having this little corners in the city accessible for creatives and artists to be themselves. The next project that I'd like to talk about, Emily, if we can go to the Arts Collaboratory section. So these are just some photos from our programs. So it was really lively. Is Arts Collaboratory. Arts Collaboratory is a translocal ecosystem of 25 diverse organizations around the world focused on art practices, processes of social change, and working with broader communities beyond the field of art. If we see the next slide, we'll see the whole group from diverse places. I joined Arts Collaboratory as a member of Al-Ma'mal, one of the organizations, and continue until today as a participant in different working groups and collaborative projects. The network transformed, and we say it mutated in its form and structure over the years. And today it is a self-organized and decentralized network. There's a lot to say about Arts Collaboratory, but what I wanted to briefly touch on in relation to our conversation was primarily the principles that we wrote up together and how they relate to my work at Dar Jacir. If we see some other slides, I really consider Arts Collaboratory as my school. It has been an ongoing learning and unlearning process. Being part of this global community of arts practitioners has greatly informed my practice and thinking as a cultural worker, and particularly the values I try to bring in my work and the relationships I build. In the next slide, we see some of the ethical principles, which are the foundations and the glue that keeps us together. They're meant more to guide us and not contain us. We review them and refer back to them in our collective activities. I'm just going to briefly just say a few words about some of the principles. So I mean, you can just flick through some of the slides as I'm speaking, so it's no particular order. Openness is our ethic to share knowledge publicly and to invite others into the ecosystem. Trust is the basis for our relationships. We have a strong faith in abilities as well as in failure. Conversation as the best means for learning and relating to each other. Critical hospitality, distinguished from the service providing hospitality and tourism, and a critical notion of friendship and conviviality. Study and critical thinking as our way for deep collaboration. Consensus and active study of dissensus. Power is dissolved through sharing. Collective risk-taking practices to permit constant mutation, change, and reevaluation. Valuing experiments and serious playfulness. Care, which works against the system of punishment, exclusion, and indifference. Degrowth as a principle of acting against the influence of the world that says bigger is better. There's many more ideas and values, but really AC was one of the first moments for me where I was invited to participate, not as in an official employee format or a team member, but as an individual, someone that is critical with ideas and thinking collectively with others, peers. It was a place where I could be vulnerable and open to share my doubts, failures, as well as my dreams. So going through that exercise of actively thinking and evaluating our principles and values, what does it mean to be a cultural worker, cannot be really taken for granted. And that was an important process and journey for me. In Palestine, and at least from my experiences, organizations are very much pushed and led by development aid and funding, which leaves little to no room for these creative processes. So when I came to Dar Jacir, and particularly through conversations and building a relationship with Emily, it was really nice to have that meeting point across generations, across practices, across experiences and knowledge. And this really informs my day-to-day at Dar Jacir.
Thank you both for for sharing those. And as you were speaking, I was just kind of writing down some of the words you were using to describe the projects and your engagements, and things like mutating, lively, multi-layered, cross-generational, experimental, artist-led, practical. And it struck me how much of a kind of genealogy for Dar Jacir just this brief presentation of these projects provides. And so I think this is a good place to really segue into speaking specifically of the site and structure of Dar Jacir. And I know you have a number of really incredible slides to take us through. So I will let you do that.
So as you had mentioned, the project began in 2014, and here I would just like to mention my co-founders, which were Anne-Marie Jacir and Yusuf Jacir, and just also mention, I wish they were both here, they could both give 2 completely amazing other lectures, but Anne-Marie, who is a filmmaker, has done also, because I do feel like this impacts the institution and what we're trying to do. And I can't believe I just used that word institution. I don't like that word. Anyway, delete that part of the thing. But she put together this groundbreaking Dreams of a Nation archive of Palestinian cinema, which she started in 2000 or in the late 90s. And she also in 2003 organized and curated the largest traveling film festival in Palestine. And in terms of Yusuf Jacir, I think just it's important to mention his role as a social worker in the camps in and around Bethlehem and Hebron. And his father, my grandfather, was a teacher, just a generational acknowledgement of things that get passed down indirectly. So Aline, do you want to say something here too for this first slide?
I think very briefly, it's just that Dar in Arabic means home. So when we say Dar Jacir, it's really the Jacir's home. And that is the environment that we want to give when we host people in the space, that it is a home, and we continue the original function and purpose of the house.
Yeah, actually, just to build on what you just said, I actually often describe what we're doing as a family. Like our artists are part of our family. We're building family. We often in our programming use terminology of family, and that is deliberate because it implies many things which maybe we can get into later. So this is a photo of our building, a photo from 1890 actually. And yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about that right now. Aline, do you want to say something here?
It's all right. You can
go back and forth with this.
No, you can go through and I'll just add in between. It's all right.
Okay. And this is a wedding taken in 1911 at the stairs going up to the building. And just to say that something that is important is that obviously the advent of steam travel, railways, improved technologies of communication in the mid to late 19th century was a critical moment for the growing interconnectedness of the world, and the merchants of Bethlehem took advantage during this era. So beginning in the 1850s, these men began breaking away from traditional methods of selling objects, and they were actually moving quite a bit around the world, to the Philippines, to Colombia, to Chile, to Europe. So in a way, the globalization of that era and all the interconnectedness and intersections of people going back and forth was, it was easier to do that then. The globalization already happened then. We went in the opposite direction kind of the rest of the world. For example, this is Sleiman's Ottoman passport. And also I should just mention, these are photos from our archive. These are for documents and photographs from our archive. which actually highlights what daily life was during those decades, even in terms of exchanges and transactions, as well as photographs taken by Palestinians themselves of themselves, which for that time period is quite rare. And I just wanted to mention here that when the British came in and they started monitoring these new external borders under their control, the result was that many Palestinians who had migrated temporarily, as is common for many Mediterranean countries, all of a sudden could not come back home. The second the British took over, they found themselves completely stuck in Colombia and in Chile, and specifically to Bethlehem. The Bethlehem community in Chile is about 500,000 Palestinians strong, and mainly from the Bethlehem area. So this steady decline of being connected to the rest of the world has not ceased, has just continued to accelerate. Yeah. And then this is also from our archive of the street, which is where the house lies, which is on the historic Jerusalem Hebron Road. It is 7 kilometers from Dar Jacir to the center of Jerusalem, and has always been a center of movement and connection. And then I feel that for the purposes of this discussion, it's really important to situate not only where we are temporarily and spatially, but that we are not in a post-colonial situation. We are living under a colonial apartheid, and that needs to be clear because that frames our site and how we operate. I mean, just look, the Union of Agricultural Work Committee in Palestine was just designated a terrorist organization this month. So in this photo here, this is on the outskirts of Bethlehem. You can see that Bethlehem has been cut off completely from its agricultural land. We are also, this is the gate to our house, situated in the most tear-gassed site in the world. Aline, jump in whenever. I feel like I'm talking too much. And Bethlehem today is surrounded by 21 settlements that have completely encircled the entire city and has confiscated all agricultural land. No one can reach their land. And then the house is 200 meters away from this watchtower, which is a frequent, in which are frequent incursions by the Israeli army who enter from that gate. Oh, sorry. This is the famous skunk truck. Checkpoint 300. This is how workers from Bethlehem and Hebron enter into Jerusalem. This is usually at dawn and takes hours. And just more footage from our street and the tear gas. And then these are the kind of canisters that we find regularly in our garden. And that's our urban farm.
So Emily, I guess at this point, unless Aline, would you like to add something to that? I was just thinking about our previous conversations and how these questions have come up and of the kind of persistent conditions of colonial apartheid, as well as the constant violence outside your gates and in May this year, also inside your compound as well. And I just, think that something that Aline said actually, as we were talking about the kind of heaviness that this persistent condition brings or could bring to the space and the work, and yet the importance of sort of continuing to find openings, to find the strength to regroup, and indeed the kind of joy of working with your artists, the collaborators, the community that you've worked very hard to build and rebuild over the years that you've been there. And you've always talked about a really significant workshop that Michael Rakowitz led early on that kind of became foundational to the thinking around the space. And I think this image of the garden is kind of perfect because it evokes a number of projects that we've talked about and that I know that you have images of. So I think this is a good time perhaps to kind of jump into some of those programs, not just as individual projects that have happened in a space like this, but actually as informing the spirit of the space, as creating the spirit of the space, and one that is, really informed by a sense of hospitality and care, as you started off by saying, with the name of this organization as well. So perhaps this is a good place to jump into those projects.
Yeah, I'll talk about Michael, and then Aline will talk about Vivian for a bit. This workshop was the very first workshop that happened at Dar Jacir in 2018. And it was conceived especially for the launch of the whole public program. We had been doing things before, which maybe we can get into later. But the thing that's really interesting about this that I think is important when we think about all the team and all the artists that are involved in this project is that it's a continuation of a conversation, I would put it that way, that Michael and I have engaged with and have had for the last 20 years. Also, Michael has a very strong relationship with Palestine, and he has been teaching there, and he came to the academy multiple times. So in some ways, this workshop was just the next step in something that has been developing and developing and developing and will continue to develop. The other thing that was really interesting about this particular workshop was that we were, at that point in time, as ridiculous as this sounds, locked out of Dar Jacir by the people who were renovating, and they wouldn't let us in the space. And so I had planned for Michael to come, and which, by the way, Michael funded himself. I think that we need to also talk about how many artists are actually in solidarity, and in terms of many other reasons are actually self-funding things to be part of the space and to do things at the space. So we had to come up with, what are we going to do if we can't get into the building? And I had this idea that, Michael had all these readings prepared, and he said, look, we could just read outside, which is did. We read in the corners and crevices and terraces all around the building. But then it was also, I said, if we can't get into our own place, we go into the houses of all the neighbors. So, and this is right here is a tour of Azza camp, which is directly across the street. So we toured and visited, and the participants were welcomed in various places on the street, including 2 refugee camps, including a bar, including a hotel, including a supermarket. It was especially touching in this particular camp, which is across the street, because when we came in, the elders of the camp asked, where is Bint Jacir? Where is the daughter of Jacir? Because they were so excited that the house was being reactivated, and they welcomed us to the street. And he said to me, we are so excited you're doing this. We have only been your neighbor for 70 years. And that is such a perfect synthesis of how we understand ourselves and our history. And it was such a beautiful and welcoming moment. Of course, the wall, we had to tour the wall because it's right there, you can't avoid it. And then in reciprocation, the workshop concluded where we invited the neighbors to a feast, which we cooked, which of course, Michael made this Iraqi maskouf dish and enlisted everyone's participation in sharing, preparing, and the meal. Here we are cooking outside because, you know, we couldn't get inside, so we had to cook everything outside on fire in fire pits that we made. And I will just end with that, just to say that, I mean, there's something about this workshop that really did set the tone going forward of how we were going to work in terms of the neighborhood, in terms of hospitality, in terms of circumventing super difficult, I mean, we're hosting people, we can't enter our own home. That was the backdrop of this workshop, and it turned into this, you know, really fruitful and fantastic discussion. And now to Vivian.
So Vivian Sansour, she's from Bethlehem, and she founded the Palestine Heirloom Seed Library, which is housed in Batir, in a nearby, near to Bethlehem. It's a heritage site right now. So Vivian came for a residency for 5 months, and during her residency, she did 2 workshops in the land. Her residency was called The Living Seed Library and Duality of Stones, stemming from the belief that architectural conservation cannot be complete without the botanical revival and preservation of the crops and plants that our ancestors developed, cultivated, and propagated for our survival. She applied her work in seed conservation in the residency, where she envisioned creating a demonstration site of heirloom varieties and a garden of biodiverse natural art. She planted the plot with mlukhiyya, a variety of mallow, and heirloom Peruvian zinnias that she was propagating. The mlukhiyya was a homage to a well-loved dish in Palestine that carries with it several stories of method, life events, and seasonal gatherings. The zinnias, which were originally passed down to her by her mentor, John Sabella, were a homage to those who came before us and gave us the seed and knowledge that has allowed us to survive for millennia. Her workshop entailed clearing the ground from glass and shrapnel, adding soil and compost, installing irrigation pipes, raising the beds, and planting the land. At the end of the season, she held a workshop called Home. It was informed by a story that Vivian encountered with a woman from the neighborhood who lost her son during clashes on the street. She recalls the mother telling her he was hungry, and when we found his body, he had a bag of chips in his pocket. He was coming home for lunch. In an attempt to reclaim the space and our sense of home, participants harvested the mlukhiyya stems, took apart the leaves, and prepared a home-cooked stew in Vivian's traveling kitchen. Throughout the workshop, participants shared stories of home and what home means to them during this process. The workshop came to a close with a delicious meal together outside in the terraces. So here, this workshop, I mean, sadly, I came right after this workshop happened to Dar Jacir, but I think it really shows how we work with the community and how the site is a place for things to happen and the potential to continue conversations around our day-to-day lives, about identity, about struggles, about lived experiences, through storytelling, cooking, and more informal spaces and intimate spaces. I don't know, Emily, if you want to share anything from your...
Okay, beautiful.
Oh, it does.
I mean, I think this is also an important time perhaps to reflect on this question of community that we've talked about and brought up that word so many times, and to think about the ways, as it came up in many of our conversations, of how that really cannot be taken for granted. And I think you've underscored that in many ways in your discussion of the actual site and context within which Dar Jacir is located, but also I have to think about, and this is certainly at the core of this organization, the idea of the fragmentation and alienation of these communities from each other by design and through violence. And so, I was very struck for the first time reading your mission statement that talked about kind of reactivating links specifically with the community of Bethlehemites in Chile that Emily referred to at the beginning, but also other kind of transnational networks across the Mediterranean, a space that certainly you're very much a part of, and yet in many ways denied access to as a cultural space. And so perhaps you want to talk a bit more about that. I know you have a couple of other projects that actually reference through vectors of sound and movement and dance, how these particular kinds of connections are being reactivated at Jacir. So,
Aline, do you want to talk about Nicholas and I'll talk about Pitsika, or?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
We can't see Nicholas. I mean, I don't see Nicholas's slide. I don't know. Maybe.
I can see
there we go.
the slide. Yeah.
Sorry, I have a bit of a lag. I hope it's not in the sound as well.
Perfect.
We can hear you well.
So Nicholas, it's an interesting story and also complements our conversation on community and creating a team or a family amongst us. Nicholas was invited by Emily firstly to participate in Michael Rakovich's workshop. So he was there from the very beginning. And then he was invited to be a resident. So during his residency, he was engaging with the space on the site, and then there's this beautiful stone storage room right next to the house. It's very tiny. It's just a square room that we had put a bunch of furniture and old things from the house. So he decided to empty it out and gifted us with a sound studio. So with equipment, very simple, like basic sound equipment for editing and the mixing sounds. And during his time, he was really interested to work with the community and held the workshops with children from the camps. So we had children from Dheshe and Aida camp come in for the workshop. It was maybe one of their first times ever to engage with sound and recording and hearing themselves. And what was beautiful is that right behind the sound studio is the urban farm. So usually when people are on site, there's things that are happening at the same time, and youth are able to engage with the different projects and residents that are present. So I won't speak more, but just to show you a little clip from the workshop.
Thank you, Aline. Okay, and then just really briefly, this was the dance project you were talking about. And here, maybe it's important to talk about this because it points to two things. One, the way we work in Bethlehem. In this particular case, we involved 5 different dance troupes in Bethlehem to take part in this workshop and to create a performance with these musicians and dancers that came from the Salento region of Italy in Puglia. And it was the first time actually that they had all gathered together to create something together in one space, because normally they're in their dance troupe space. And then the other thing I think would be important to say about this workshop too is, again, what you were pointing to, Rattan, right now, which was that we are part of a shared history of the Mediterranean and a shared history of exchanges and exchange and traces left on both shores of the Mediterranean, on both sides, on all sides. So the project was basically taking Pitsika and Debka and creating a new form through this workshop, both with musicians and with dancers. And I'll just play you a little bit of that, what the culmination of that collaboration became. It's 10 minutes, I won't play all of it.
Emily, I just wanted to add about the video and the project in general. We can put it down maybe. Well, mainly is that I think with this project, bringing together the Pitsika dance in particular with Dabke, there was a lot of similarities in the beat, in the dance steps. I mean, it's different, but there was something that they were able to relate to it quickly. Some of these youth dancers are 13 or 14 years old, and within 5 days, they were able to pick up like a lot of the dance moves, the very basics of Pitsika, and share Dabke with the Italian musicians and dancers. And at the end of the workshop, it was supposed to be a flash mob in the streets, but that night it was pouring rain. So that's why we did it inside. So it's not like we wanted it to be inside the space. And we put it on live and it went viral. Like all of Bethlehem had reached the Pitsika Dabke dance before Corona, before the pandemic. So you're already online. And also that this is a project that's still ongoing and unfolding in different ways. One of the musicians did workshops in Italy, and we're planning to continue this through more workshops and residencies and exchanges. So like most of our projects, there's a continuity with the artists, with the community, so that we can reach more people.
Fantastic. Thank you, both of you. I mean, I think watching this footage from both the workshops does kind of, one, bring up this question of, continuous collaboration that you mentioned is kind of a very strong pillar of your program. The idea of a family, as Emily invoked it, and this idea of people coming and coming again, and once artists and others begin to work with you, there being this continuous traffic back and forth whenever possible. And of course, the pandemic, the kind of inevitable question of what that has meant for you and what that has done in terms of your programming and in terms of your operations. I think this is a question that is perhaps on everyone's mind, and I was very struck by this discussion when we had it in our own chats leading up to this. So maybe you want to say something about the effects of COVID in this particular context.
Emily's pointing at me to speak. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because lots of people ask us about what we did or how the pandemic affected us. And it was a little bit like, it wasn't so surprising other than the lockdown and being home. But otherwise, I think the condition for Palestine and Palestinian arts workers, we're always faced by obstacles and challenges where we have actually been in lockdowns before. Maybe not in this way, but we've lived it through the intifadas. So finding other ways and forms or spaces to gather and be together was sort of very intuitive, and we just jumped into it. Like 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the lockdown came into force, we were already online. We continued our programs, our seminars, our projects. And it was something that we were already doing. So it didn't feel so unusual or different. Also, some of our team members are not all in Palestine. So working on Zoom and having these meetings online, working remotely was part of our practice anyways. We did in the beginning of 2020, the spring and summer, we did a program called the Solidarity and Care Program that was online, where we reached back to artists that were with us in the first 2 years of our programs. And they all sort of did a program of their, or event of their own. And it was really nice because we were able to stay connected, even if it was virtually. We tried to create intimate spaces through workshops so that we can meet and talk. Michael Radkovich returned, so people cooked and ate together. Yeah, the pandemic was just another obstacle in our lifeline that we're used to detouring.
Yeah. I guess maybe this is perhaps the last couple of questions before we move into the kind of closing section, but I think it is important to return to this notion of infrastructure and some of the kind of nuts and bolts of that. Emily brought up the fact that a number of artists and participants have actually self-funded or come to Darjasa to do work that they feel very strongly about without the expectation of funding. But perhaps particularly in light of the funding situation, even in the subcontinent, and this being a question that is on the minds of everyone who is trying to work independently or create spaces, to talk a little bit more about the particular conditions under which you have been able to get some funding or have faced challenges getting funding. And the other question, which is somewhat different, but also I find somewhat related, is this question of being a space that is women-led and certainly artist-led, but also women-led. And I think it would be important to put that on the table and to hear about both of your experiences negotiating various interactions and authorities as women leading this really important and very, very rooted project. So take that in whichever order or however you'd like to respond between the both of you, but I thought maybe we'll end with those questions for the moment.
The question of funding it's a big topic, actually. I can say that, our initial founding was funded by a crowdfunding campaign that was full of people from Chile to America to Italy to the Middle East that Anne-Marie, my sister, and I have been cultivating for decades through not just our work as artists and filmmakers, but our work as activists, our work as organizers. So there was a solid set of people out there who wanted to support this project. The question of funding regionally, which, we were really lucky from 2018 through 2019, we had an EU grant from Sweden. But the thing that was most important to me about that grant was actually the infrastructure around it and the way we were forced into dealing with our space made me realize and be very grateful later when that grant ended and our space and our team and our objectives and our vision became healthier. It was actually really unhealthy for us to have that grant, just putting it simply. I could go into details if needed about why it was not useful. Very I don't know what the word is, but anyway, Aline, I've been losing my words.
No, but I was gonna say is that with the Catan and CEDA grant, it's like much of the funding that comes into Palestine, they come with conditions, with certain formats and ideas that they want to impose on us and what sort of programs they want us to do. In a way, it's like they're informing what the cultural sphere should look like according to their developmental backgrounds, and it's all development money. There's no or little to none philanthropy that can really give arts organizations and artists freedom to work in a more experimental, discursive way. And it's more about numbers, about log frames, about bureaucracy, and so on. And this was, it's a little bit unfortunate that was the experience for the first foundation years, the inaugural program, but it was also a learning process. So when I joined, Emily really invited me to discuss, like, to evaluate those 2 years together and to think together forward, like, how do we want to work? And then here came the idea of, let's think one, to minimize costs and try to work in a collective way. The idea of an artist-led organization or collective was already there from the beginning, but how to further that and open it up for more artists to join. So we started thinking a lot, and it's not like we found the perfect model, but we're trying as much as possible to steer away from these big grants that have conditions, whether on how we use the money or with whom. This is something else that is a problem in Palestine, is that these foundations have their own policies about who is Palestinian or who can participate based on your geography or your location. So us in Bethlehem, we're in the West Bank. Any funds that come to us or would be dedicated to us are part of West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, but it negates the 48 areas and diaspora. So we actually are not allowed to be active in any way from these funds in the 48 areas because that would go under a separate EU office. So in that sense, they are actually continuing the colonial structures of separating and fragmenting us. So in that sense, we're trying to be as independent as possible, from funding to activities to team members. It's a bit of a challenge, but we try to find the ways. And I think what we're trying to do now is build onto the crowdfunder that Emily and Anne-Marie started at the beginning, and to expand our donor database from individuals that really believe in us and don't put conditions on us.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add to that, the thing about working with Aline, which was really important for me and why I wanted her and hunted her down to be part of this project, is that we talk about every aspect of what we're doing. We literally, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it like this? What does this title mean? What does that title mean? And that is an essential part of the process. And I often say, like, I love this idea that we are constantly coming into being, and maybe we'll never be in being. We're just in this process of constantly coming into being, which made me think of the scaffolding you and Natasha mentioned at the beginning, and this idea of scaffolding being movable and also being supportive, which I like, that the scaffolding itself is an infrastructure that's portable and also changeable, that also kind of connotes something in process, which really resonates with what we're doing.
Yeah, and I mean, in this case, it really strikes me as you were talking about this question, how much the kind of scaffolding provided by transnational solidarity, for example, has been something to rely on and to kind of fall back on after these experiences that you described in terms of larger developmental and international grant funding. And perhaps, this is a good place to transition to another set of images that we put together very quickly, that we'll go through very briefly, and just sort of think about the ways in which these have emerged in the course of our own dialogue in the last couple of months, and speak to the kind of personal associations, political stakes, historical events, and present-day conditions that our conversations across West and South Asia by way of New York have been kind of peppered with and preoccupied with. And we're going to put these on the table sort of as possible threads for a continued discussion. And Natasha, please come in after this, and we want to open this up to everyone. So I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. And can you all see this? Great. So yeah, we'll just go through this and perhaps say a sentence or two about each of these images.
So these are Indian army troops in Jerusalem. That's all I'm going to say.
Are these World War I images, Emily? Yes. This is quite an iconic image from Delhi airport in March 1980 during the visit of Yasser Arafat. And here you see Arafat with Indira Gandhi, the prime minister at the time, and to her left is Narasimha Rao, who was to become prime minister about a decade later. And this sort of represents, in some ways, the kind of height of Indian solidarity with the Palestinian people, and the kind of generosity and welcome and relationship that actually Indira Gandhi and Yasser Arafat shared with each other. So I will leave it at that.
A poster, Salute the New State of Palestine, published by the Embassy of the PLO, New Delhi Mission of the League of Arab States, 1988.
This is a book that I came across recently and is a recent publication in 2014, From India to Palestine, Essays in Solidarity, which is edited by Geeta Hariharan and has a wonderful introduction by the Palestinian writer Raja Shahade, published by Leftward Books in 2014.
This passport is valid for all countries of the world except Israel. This recently changed. It's a Bangladeshi passport. And this was once written on Indian passports, and I think it was changed in the 90s.
Yep, 1991, 92.
Carlos Latouf's take on the current political climate. I think it speaks for itself.
My grandmother in Bombay, when she lived there.
This is a work by the artist Mudassir Gul, which is now destroyed. That was in Srinagar. This is an image from May this year, May 2021. And following this particular action by the artist and his collaborators, 20 people were arrested for raising pro-Palestinian slogans in Srinagar.
Kashmir and Palestine will be free one day, inshallah. Graffiti on a segregation wall just down the street from Dar Jacir in Bethlehem.
Thank you. It felt really important to actually have that circulation of images towards the end, to really also bring in the kind of trans-regional and intersectional perspective around Palestine. And I just, before going into the audience questions, because I don't want to take away time from those who have been keenly listening to us, I had to think about Athar Zia, who has been, quite prolific as a Kashmiri anthropologist, poet, and again, really thinking about how to build solidarity also through poetry and through authorship at different levels, and especially something that we might come back to, Emily and Aline, in relation to agriculture, and the cutting off of terrain and resource extractivism, and at the same time terrorizing and creating terrorism, at redefining terrorism at the level of those who are food producers. That is something that also resonates, as you all know, very much within our context in India at this point in time. And so I was thinking about the symbolism of the watermelon, of the olive, and then of apples in relation to Kashmir. And just this kind of short tweet by Athar Zia, who wrote, "May the harvest of all your toils be bountiful, beloved Kashmir. Your apples of your eyes eating your apples. Your rains go easy, your snows kind. Tyrants on your soil vanish like flakes on the hot coils in your loving Kangar." And this way of speech, it's something that's also very shared. And I wanted to maybe just seek your comments on this before. I have many questions, but then we will be going into the audience questions.
Emily, you're muted.
Is that a prompt for me to respond? I thought you were going to respond.
I mean, I would just add to that to what Natasha's putting on the table, and certainly speak to the farmers movement in India, which has been ongoing for well over a year now, and has been an incredibly powerful movement that unfortunately does not appear in mainstream media outlets, but to actually create a kind of parallel between the kind of poetic and folk archive of songs, sayings, and knowledge that's being generated in the context of those front lines of that movement, particularly around the borders of Delhi, but also across many parts of the country. And so, no, just to put it to you in terms of how that kind of reinvigoration of a destroyed soil, a destroyed and fragmented land is very much part of your imagination for Jacir. Another thing that appears in actually your mission statement as well, agricultural activities are at the core of this project. And so perhaps, yeah, you can speak.
No, I mean, just to say that the agricultural activities became and continue to unfold into becoming one of the biggest cores of our project because of the particularity of the situation that Bethlehem finds itself in, but in those other cities of the West Bank that are not there yet, they're going there. It's kind of like this, if you want to see where you're going, just look at Bethlehem or Hebron, which is if you look in the Hebron Hills and all around the city of Hebron, and the settlements taking agricultural land, it's really, it's overwhelming. I don't know. I mean, it's really overwhelming. So this idea of the green space was also because there is no green space in Bethlehem for people to eat, live, grow, learn together. And so this was essential to us, but also more importantly, essential to the artists that were working in the land, people like Muhammad Saleh, Vivian Sansour, and their whole practice, Hassan Muammar, like all of these guys who are part of our project. Hassan, who is from Batir, to protect the terraces of his village, which is the village right outside of Bethlehem, he managed to turn it into a UNESCO heritage site, because hoping that this would offer some kind of protection, but it hasn't. There are settler raids all the time. So yeah, Aline, do you want to add anything to this?
I mean, your words, Natasha, and was really beautiful. Actually gave me some goosebumps on my hands because I could really relate to it. I think with Attar Jacir, I mean, Emily has given the landscape that we're in, but Palestinians as a people have always been so connected to land, like seasons, the harvests, our rituals, our feasts, our everything are around the land. Like we're still we've up until the British Mandate in the 1900s, we were always in the land. So in these workshops and programs and opening up the terraces to become green spaces for the community is extremely vital to continue our connection with the land. One project that we didn't talk about, which is the urban farm, Muhammad Saleh, a permaculturist and agriculture worker, activist.
If you want them.
Yeah, you could put them up actually, yeah. He proposed to turn one of the terraces into an urban farm one, he did a similar process to Vivian's where he cleared up the grounds. They all worked on it together with the community. These youth probably don't have any chances to plant and work with the earth and feel it physically and experience it. They put soil in the ground, they put the pipes together, they learned about plants. and they actually planted various greens and vegetables that they harvested. And we are hoping to continue this project so that the urban farm actually becomes something that the Jacir family, our artists, or in our community can access. And it's part of a long research that Muhammad is doing about actually how to activate an urban farm and keep it sustainable. So it's bringing back, the outskirts into the city and reconnecting with the earth. So this is something that we're continuing with. And I think now that we're just finished off the olive harvest, so it's always a beautiful time, but also very sad because so many trees are cut down by settlers or burnt. So we're constantly facing these this violence to the land and nature. So in the space that we do have, we try to open it up and maintain that.
Thank you. Taking from an audience question, Priyanka Chaudhary responded to some of the footage that you shared also around the workshops and the more sort of residential activities with some of the international artists, and asks, what shifts and what remains with the participants who sort of join in, whether you have a strong agenda or sort of how far you reach with your plans. I mean, given also what you talked about in terms of also not even being able to enter the house at a certain point, and with Michael Racco, it's really taking forward from the outside. I mean, being welcomed into neighbors' homes. I feel you have actually addressed this. But in case you still want to talk a little bit also about what it's meant for the local community to join in and participate, because that's also been a question from two of our guests today.
Emily, are you trying to speak?
Yeah. Sorry, I had a mute thing. The question about community locally is really interesting because it's working on multiple levels with us. It really is, because with the kids that are coming to work on the land, we really are trying to foster this relationship with the land that would hopefully be continued outside of the space and that they would carry with them, because it's actually a heritage, as Vivian so eloquently said when she came to do the first residency. The dancing exchange we had with Italy, it's also like the intention there is just, it's also to resist that this generation is cut from what I consider their heritage, which is a larger Mediterranean culture and heritage. And that does continue, not only continuing because we are working with our partners there to continue, but on an individual level that has nothing to do with us, with participants in contact with musicians or dancers and doing exchanges by themselves. That's precisely what we wanted in the end. I think another element that we didn't discuss also is that our intention really that this space is a place where artists program what they want to program. They feel safe to come to us to, like Melek is a good example. Maybe Aline can speak about Melek's philosophy workshops, but that has also been one of our missions, is to foster that kind of space and make sure, because it actually works in opposition to how all of this EU and other funding in the area works. It's the kind of inverse of that, which is like, we're saying, we trust you as artists. We're interested in making mistakes, in experimentation, in discussing without an output, whatever, So this is really important as well, is fostering that with younger artists and filmmakers and researchers. I don't know if Aline wanted to add to this.
I mean, it might be a bit cheesy, but really it's, for me, at least what I see from participants, it's really about building relationships, creating safe spaces, intimacy, and building these relationships on a human, like a person-to-person level. Without that trust and that care and that sensitivity around each project and program, I don't think we would have been able to maintain that So many times we see participants in workshops and then they suddenly come to our screenings. They might suggest their own film to screen. So it's a constant dialogue with participants, and really, like I say, we keep saying family, but it is that. Our space is a home, so we also have a limit on how many people we can bring in. So our workshops don't exceed 15 or 18 people. We maintain that. Sometimes we even make a bit of a selection or a targeted outreach so that we can make sure that others have a chance or an opportunity. Some things we don't announce publicly, but only afterwards, like after the workshop has happened, to keep those spaces safe and secure. It's a queer space. It's a space for everybody to be there. Everyone is welcome. So just building those relationships with, considering all the political, and we haven't even touched on like social and economical problems that we face on a day-to-day, but to have the space that artists, creatives, youth can be in is really important. It does require us more time from us to really think through each project. So Emily like touched on this, that we really study how we address our, like when we do an announcement, it doesn't come easily. We actually really look carefully and study the words that we use, what ways we address people. So it's a constant study of what does it mean to host these spaces and hold it for participants so they can feel trusted in the work that we do.
Wonderful. So we have quite a few questions.
Oh, I just wanted to add one small thing. Sorry, I'm having a problem with this mute button. I don't think I'm going to mute anymore. It's just that the thing about the space and the question of the local community also is that it is like a family in the sense that it's shifting all the time. Sometimes it's closed. Sometimes we're open for a big dinner party. Sometimes it's just about cinema. Sometimes it's just about, philosophy. And this kind of, it's an ever-changing space. And that energy is also really important to us as well. Sometimes the family is not there. Sometimes they are there. Sometimes so-and-so went off to India for 6 months and now they're coming back. I mean, there's also that element of it, of movement, which is also important.
Sure. So I'm just going to jump into another question then, Emily, which is of connecting to something you said about walking as a practice of knowing the city, where we have the audience member asking, I was curious about the idea of walking in a place as specific as Palestine, where the very act becomes difficult, tiresome, and conspicuous, almost a performance in itself, and more so with the cohort. Could you please speak more to this not so everyday act and expand on the experiences of the people walking along?
I'm not sure I understand the question. That act becomes difficult, tiresome. I actually do see it as an everyday act. I don't know if I can talk about it outside of it being an everyday act. Yes, it's true. I've used it as a pedagogical inquiry into the place that we live, but it's important that it's an everyday act and that it's a daily practice, because it's through that daily practice of walking that then you start to understand what's happening around you. So this idea of it not being I can't unmarry it from the idea that it's an everyday act.
Sure, I guess there's also a mention of it within this context being one that is prone to being surveilled, prone to be made to wait, prone to be searched, and perhaps maybe there's something in that as well. Of course, just wondering if that's something that's also, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is part of it. And there's also the fact of being a woman walking in a public space and all of that entails in an environment like that, and the risk that entails as well, or not. Yeah, it's, I don't know what to say, because that part that you just described is actually part of the everyday. So to kind of remove it out of that discussion is a bit difficult, because that is what it is. That is the everyday. That is just simply the everyday.
Sure. Yeah, no, of course. Important to acknowledge that fully, for those who have to also continually cross despite the dangers and the turbulences. There's another question which goes like, while hope is integral to our collective challenges in states of oppression, particularly in the global south, hope also seems to be an excuse for the first world and other passive actors. For example, heirloom seeds and ideas of regeneration and preservation are easily co-opted into possible narratives and under sterile terms like agroactivism, instead of being read as forms of resisting erasure and preserving embodied knowledge in response to urgent, violent conditions. I read somewhere, hope sprouting from the ruins. Can these narratives be tackled?
Do either of you want to? I feel like I'm hogging all the questions.
No, I can like touch a little bit. Yeah, I don't know, like hope it's something difficult to talk about in that sense, but we're tackling these narratives on various levels and spaces. So I think every act that we do, just our physical presence is also, or being together, the fact that someone from Jerusalem or from Haifa comes to Bethlehem and is there is like already hope of some sort of unity and community. But I think the Palestinian condition is constantly being creative, not to get stuck in ruins, but to I mean, the quote that you bring, like sprouting from the ruins, is exactly what we do. Of course, we tackle these. I think the most important thing is to have these international exchanges and forums for discussion, so that yeah, we're not just working on our own, but these narratives get changed and shared with other communities that can have more of an impact on what's happening on the ground. Because we're, in the end of the day, we're quite limited what we do in Palestine, because there's so much violence and oppression. So Experimenters, Futures Hub, and others are exactly the avenues that, or the platforms that we'd want to be talking about these narratives.
I was just going to add very quickly that I think in some ways the projects that you talked about, particularly in the context of this question around ideas of regeneration and preservation, that can be easily co-opted, certainly in developmental narratives and other sort of discursive regimes that emerge from parts of the world that seek to kind of control or co-opt this. I think that the work speaks really to the ways in which you are actually very actively resisting and thinking through regeneration as an act of resistance, and as something that is much more kind of resilient in the face of this kind of exchange and this kind of discursive co-optation. And I think this kind of links also to the question of heritage, which I know is another question that Natasha may bring up, but I did want to introduce this idea that, which is very much part of your organization, that you're also an archive, and that hasn't come up yet. And I wanted to, maybe being a historian, it's my duty to kind of bring up the fact that you are also housing this archive of materials from the late 19th and 20th century, from the Ottoman period, and that itself is very much an act of kind of resistance to certain narratives about this place, Palestine, being a place without people, and of course a very valuable resource to researchers. So I just wanted to kind of intervene here and just ask about that particular archive and how you envision it and how it's already being used. Whoever would like to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of is linked to the question that was asked previously, but the archive ideally would be available to be used by the public. the thing is, and what the archive is for those that don't know, is that it is ephemera as well as letters, documents, photos, and many other things that are from the late Ottoman period, which is why they really are so precious, because through that archive, if and when researchers can use it and activate it, it actually will reframe the narrative and the situatedness of Bethlehem, both regionally and globally. And I think that that's really important. Now, I should bring this in because you kind of asked this earlier of me and Aline, but we didn't really answer to it. The archive, we need to preserve it. We need to digitize it. There is a huge, massive infrastructure around an archive. This project is already massive enough. And also I'm an artist and I love being an artist. So it's kind of like drowning in all of this stuff. And how are we going to do all this stuff? So this is the intention of the archive. The newspapers have been mapped because there's a newspaper collection as well. And that also is something like an archive is really a matter of funding, So that is a project in process that we would like to really develop further, but it's a struggle. I mean, can't do everything. I wish I could.
There's another question from the audience, and we have a few more minutes together today. So have you noticed a change or shift since you started the foundation? And also, again, this sort of pertains to the idea of heritage. I mean, given that this is the home itself has its own sort of history or counter history, also within this area. So how to sort of, really also consider, given, as you said, the fact that this is one of the most, or the most tear bomb, a tear gas site in the world. What is, maybe perhaps we can dwell a bit on this also, on the challenge of it.
Yeah, I mean, the question of heritage, I think, is integral to the site and also something that's still unfolding, because we have the heritage of the building itself when it was built, but then interestingly, that space is part of the commons of Bethlehem in a way, because it's a known site for when these events happen on the ground. So, and the public feels a kind of ownership of the site on that level, which is quite interesting to unpack. And then there's the physicality of the architecture, and then there's the archive of the landscape itself, like the archive of what is in that land, what grows, what didn't grow, what remains, So I think it's evolving. It continues to evolve. It also continues to get destroyed, and then we have to go straight into healing and then evolving. So I don't think we're at a point, or at least I'm not at a point where I can actually properly answer that question. Not because it's not something we don't think about or we address, but just because it's really in such a process right now. I don't know, Aline, you want to add anything to that too?
No, I think you spoke about it very like spot on. Like, it's still evolving. We're still a new organization or a space that's active there. Like, our program started in 2018. So it really takes time to involve the community. Like when the site is ever attacked or damaged because of the clashes on the street, some people come up to us and they apologize somehow. So there is this awareness that, we have to protect it. But this needs time for families, for children, for youth, and even the actual the municipality. Like, these heritage isn't on the top of their lists, but these are the conversations that we're trying to share with the community and to raise. So yeah, it's evolving, it's a process, and it will take time. Hopefully we can see more
But then when
Yeah.
the question is, what types of heritage do your participants value the most? I would say that also shifts with the participants, because there are those who are working in the land. But then, you know, when we were doing the newspaper archive, we had all of these interns from Bethlehem University, and they went crazy. They had never, these are like 18-year-old kids. They'd never seen these newspapers this old and what was written. And I found them like they were trying to look up things from their own history or their grandparents' history. So, and it was really active. So while we were mapping them, this whole other dialogue and process was happening. So it depends on what, because there's, as we said, there's all these facets, but that's definitely something we have to develop.
Thank you for that response. There's a beautiful quote by W.E.B. Du Bois that has been placed by an audience member within the chat. And with this, I'm also thinking that there's so many ways in which, again, the sort of history as well of race and racialization, racialized violence, incarceration, all speak to this specific moment, like you said, Emily, of the fact of what it means to persist in the face of colonial apartheid, the persistence of it as very much a continuous and enduring effort in which all of us are responsible, complicit, and mourning. And really with this, I would thank you very much, all of you. There's also other notes of gratitude by Abdullah Karoum, by others who have been part of the session today, listening in. Also thinking very much of really what Hortense Spillers calls grammars of dissent, how to activate these grammars in our midst in different contexts and together. Thank you, Aline, Emily, and Rattanamol for being such wonderful partners in dialogue. And with that, I announce tomorrow we're going to have our speakers, Elvira Deangani Oze and Lily Hall, who are going to be in conversation, also discussing very much their work together at the showroom, discussing methodologies, discussing questions of community building in their context. So we welcome you to join in. And then finally, we will have all of the speakers together on the closing day on Sunday. So keep some time in your schedules this weekend. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. It was
Thank you
wonderful.
so much. Absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, audience. And please read the blog, as Natasha mentioned, as well as spread the word around. More the people join, the better, and keep asking questions.
Yeah, and do come back on Sunday. Hope to see you all.
And tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow as well. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.